So the fact that Kissinger signs off on these weapons is not any indication of pro-Israel bias. It's just an indication that he wanted to keep the Soviets out and he wanted to keep the territorial status quo within the region. Nixon further adds to this idea when he authorizes the resupply flights to Israel. In doing so, he tells Kissinger that, quote, "The purpose of supplies is not simply to fuel the war. The purpose is to maintain the balance, because only with balance in that area can there be an equitable settlement that doesn't do in one side or the other." Then later on, in a telephone conversation with Kissinger, Nixon says that, quote, "The one thing we have to be concerned with is that the Israelis, when they finish collaborating the Egyptians and Syrians, which they will do, will be even more impossible to deal with than before. We must have a diplomatic settlement there." Nixon's point was that the U.S. would have to compensate for any lopsided Israeli victory by pressuring them during negotiations. And this is something that is brought up again and again when Nixon and Kissinger are talking to other countries, specifically the Arab states, because the Arabs send a representative to the White House, and he meets with Kissinger, and Kissinger tells him, in order to allay his fears, that, quote, "If Israel cannot win a war in 6 days, it obviously cannot fight without assurances of U.S. support. That is the new reality. Our influence can now be more effective," and by their influence, he meant their influence over Israel. Now, as I've already alluded to, Nixon and Kissinger's behavior during this crisis must also be placed in the context of the Cold War. Nixon and Kissinger wanted to ensure that the United States remained the go-to power for negotiations, and wanted to prevent the Soviets from usurping it in this role. The fact that the Soviets were arming the Arabs greatly alarmed Nixon and Kissinger, who feared that this support could be leveraged by the Soviets to gain influence among the Arabs. The fact that the administration is supporting the Israelis with weapons is basically showing that they're going tit for tat with the Soviets, just like many other Cold War conflicts at the time. Nixon and Kissinger chose to stress this Cold War motivation most aggressively when it came to explaining their actions to their allies. So, for example, when Kissinger meets with the Portuguese ambassador to thank him for allowing the U.S. to use Portuguese air bases to refuel their flights, Kissinger says that, quote, "The U.S. is not anti-Arab, but cannot encourage Soviet adventurism to the tune of 280 aircraft engaged in resupply flights for the Arabs. This could have too many consequences everywhere." Similarly, Nixon instructed U.S. diplomats to ask Europeans who might have objected to the U.S. actions during this war whether quote, "they think it is in their interests to encourage an adventurous Soviet foreign policy." He then added, "I don't think we should be too apologetic to them." Clearly, Cold War considerations overshadowed any concern for Israel's security. Yet in spite of all this evidence to the contrary, many still today believe that Nixon saved Israel, and that in spite of